Hello, and welcome to another episode of Life Telos' First Principle. Today I want to talk about Nietzsche, one of the most brilliant, fiery, unsettling, and misunderstood thinkers in the Western canon. He saw the shadow side of moral authority long before most people could even detect it. But he also had blind spots that matter, especially when his ideas get taken as a model for how we should live in a society of millions. He didn't call it Life Telos, but his project aligns very much with what I've been saying in this series about how our reification of abstract thought dissociates us from embodied life. Nietzsche hated moral dogma, metaphysical abstractions, priestly systems, otherworldly values, anything that pulled people away from embodied vitality. And what he put in their place was strength, vitality, becoming, health, courage, and saying yes to life. He didn't call that telos, but the movement was the same, from disembodied authority to the living pulse of existence itself. He saw life's direction for the individual, the thinker, the creator, the one who breaks free from herd morality and herd mentality. But he didn't ask, what does life require collectively? What does flourishing look like at the level of a community? How does vitality scale? What ecosystem allows higher individuals to appear in the first place? He didn't see that life's telos doesn't stop at the boundary of the individual. It continues into cooperation, stability, reciprocity, and sustained social complexity. So today, I want to explore Nietzsche's brilliance and his limitations, and then offer a reframing that I think preserves what's best in his work while situating it within something he didn't fully consider: what life needs for a social species at our scale. Nietzsche looked at the moral systems of his time, Christian morality, Victorian norms, political virtue, and saw that much of what passed for morality was really a hidden power play, a way for the weak to shame the strong, a way for elites to keep things in place for their own benefit, and a way to reward conformity while calling it virtue. He saw how entire cultures collapse into herd mentality, people believing they're being virtuous when they're really just being compliant. And he's dead right about that. Nietzsche's diagnosis of ressentiment remains one of his most psychologically penetrating critiques. Ressentiment is what happens when people feel powerless or unable to act, and instead of acknowledging their frustration, they convert that buried anger into moral judgment. It's a kind of psychological revenge. Rather than striving for strength or excellence, they declare strength itself immoral. From this, Nietzsche believed slave morality was born, a value system created not from genuine virtue, but from resentment disguised as righteousness. He gave people permission to step outside their inherited moral assumptions and ask, does this actually serve life? From this critique, Nietzsche offered a radical counter-ideal, the Übermensch, a human being who authors their own values, practices self-mastery, faces necessary pain rather than avoids it, creates rather than conforms, aligns with their own life force, and becomes a living expression of courage and creativity. It's powerful, it's inspiring, and it remains deeply relevant to anyone trapped inside inherited narratives. And Nietzsche wasn't promoting hedonism or chaos. He emphasized discipline, strength, responsibility, and self-mastery. Holding Nietzsche's Übermensch in mind, I asked myself, what would society look like if every single person lived as Nietzsche's higher individual, as an Übermensch? If everyone authored their own morality, if everyone lived beyond inherited norms, if everyone generated their own value system from scratch, what would that look like? How would it work? Through the lens of life telos, the answer becomes clear. Social systems would collapse. Because human beings aren't just individuals. We're a deeply social species. We're dependent on coordination, cooperation, shared norms, predictable expectations, trust, and a common moral grammar. These aren't cultural conveniences, they're biological necessities. A society where everyone is a solitary value creator might produce individual freedom, but not social cohesion. It will produce fragmentation, distrust, and breakdown. Self-mastery alone is not enough to hold a society together. This is Nietzsche's structural blind spot. In the wider conversation about Nietzsche, two camps tend to dominate. First camp, A, the critics. Thinkers like MacIntyre, Habermas, Berlin, Nussbaum, and Charles Taylor argue that Nietzsche's ethics simply cannot work at social scale. Generally, they say, Nietzsche misunderstands what holds societies together. They point to his lack of attention to cooperation, shared values, institutions, and the cultural system that makes creativity possible. They see the blind spot, but often resolve it by rejecting his brilliance altogether. Their conclusion is essentially Nietzsche's insightful, yeah, but unusable. And I believe this camp gets stuck there. They don't take the next step. They don't ask, what else would need to be true for Nietzsche's insights to be preserved and still serve a vital social function? That question shifts us from critique to integration, from this can't work to how do we keep what's brilliant without destabilizing the society that makes that brilliance possible? More on this in a minute. Then there's Camp B, the admirers, people like Kaufman, Niehaus, Deleuze, Leiter, scholars who want to preserve the brilliance and vitality of his work. They tend to reinterpret him in ways that downplay or bracket the social implications. Their implicit stance is Nietzsche is basically right, and he wasn't offering a social blueprint, so don't look too closely at the scale problem. They preserve Nietzsche's insights but ignore his blind spots. Their loyalty to his genius makes it difficult to confront the parts that don't scale. I propose an alternative to camps A and B, camp C, the synthesis. My approach doesn't reject Nietzsche or romanticize him. It holds on to what's brilliant while placing it in the larger system of human interdependence that he didn't address. And this becomes surprisingly simple through the lens of life telos. The perspective doesn't require being a Nietzsche scholar. It just requires a different compass, one grounded in human development, flourishing, and the reality of social systems. When you use life as your compass rather than textual interpretation, certain things that seem philosophically complex become practically obvious. Individual excellence depends on social cohesion. Creativity depends on stability. Self-mastery depends on systems of support. Seen through that lens, Nietzsche's blind spot comes into view. It was simply outside the frame he was working within. When you situate self-authorship inside the biological and social reality of a social species, the higher individual stops looking like a contemptuous aristocrat and starts looking like something far healthier, a responsible minority whose gifts serve the whole, a member of a creative class whose insights only exist because the larger community sustains them. Let's pause and consider everything that makes a self-authored person possible. Language, infrastructure, safety, food systems, education, knowledge accumulated over centuries. All of this was built by generations of so-called herds. The Übermensch only stands tall because countless ordinary people built the world he stands on. This calls for gratitude, not disdain. Gratitude grounds the higher individual in reality, keeps creativity connected to life, and prevents superiority from collapsing into tyranny or isolation. And once you recognize that the so-called higher individual depends on the herd, Nietzsche's contempt starts to look uncomfortably like the very thing he denounced, a kind of inverted resentment, a Nietzschean shadow. When you forget your dependence, contempt becomes a way of defending against it. Gratitude is the antidote. So here's the synthesis. Human societies do need a minority of deeply reflective, courageous, self-authored individuals, people who question inherited norms, imagine new ways of living, and challenge stagnation. But their role is not dominance or to isolate themselves. It's stewardship. They're the tributaries feeding the river, not mountains standing above it. They're contributors, not overlords or hermits. And their creativity only exists because the larger community sustains them. Now let me return to the earlier thought experiment for a minute. If everyone dug deeply into their life force, shed illusions, cultivated discipline, faced necessary pain, and took responsibility for their own becoming, would they end up in wildly different moral universes? I don't think so. The details would differ, but the principles would converge, because if they dig deep enough, they're not inventing morality, they're discovering what life itself requires for flourishing. Truthfulness, courage, compassion, responsibility, respect for reality, and care for the fragile ecosystem of relationships that sustain human life. And if such people get together, they won't produce dogma. They'll articulate living principles, flexible, grounded, and resistant to becoming tools of oppression. And if their self-mastery has any value, it's not just for the glorification of the individual. It's also in sharing the fruits of their discoveries with the culture they are embedded in, with a herd. That's the dialectic. It's always there. The task is to keep collective values alive and connected to life without letting them harden into an oppressive orthodoxy. There's a real-world example of what I'm describing, the American founders. You don't have to be American to appreciate them. This isn't about patriotism. It's about a rare moment when a handful of human beings acted with extraordinary insight, restraint, and responsibility. They didn't build a pure democracy. They were suspicious of pure democracy because they understood the psychology of human groups. They knew that societies of millions require stability, shared norms, checks on powers, and structures that restrain the passions of the moment. So they built a constitutional republic, a system designed to hold both individuals and institutions accountable. A system that restrains power, disperses authority, protects the individual from the majority, and protects the majority from corrupt elites, and continually corrects its errors through debate and amendments. And this is precisely what I mean by Camp C, a responsible minority whose role is stewardship based on fundamental principles, not domination, a creative class whose insights serve life at the scale of society. Their vision wasn't just to create a nation, it was a blueprint for how human beings might live together in freedom without collapsing into chaos, how individual greatness and social cohesion might coexist. And when I reflect on this, I feel both admiration and grief, because systems like this are fragile. They depend on virtues and commitments that must be renewed every generation. They can be corrupted, captured, hollowed out, or turned against themselves. They can decay when resentment replaces responsibility, when tribes replace citizens, and when truth fragments into incompatible worlds. The founders were attempting exactly what Nietzsche didn't address. Not heroic isolation, but mature responsibility. Not disdain, but gratitude. Not escape from society, but contribution to it. Their achievement was rare and noble, and deeply aware of human frailty. I can't help but cry sometimes, watching these foundations strain under cultural fragmentation and ideological capture. I feel awe and gratitude for what those founding fathers built, and grief for how fragile it is, and concern for what happens if we let it unravel. And it brings us back to Nietzsche, because the real question isn't simply whether individual greatness is possible, it's whether individual greatness can be integrated into the fabric of society without tearing it apart. The American founders attempted exactly that. They were a real-world Camp C, and their experiment remains one of humanity's finest attempts at aligning individual freedom with the long-term requirements of social life. Nietzsche was right about so much. He saw the emptiness of herd mentality, he called us to courage, self-mastery, and creative authorship. But he missed something vital. We're a social species, and life itself has a telos, a direction, a logic, a set of requirements. Self-authorship flourishes only when it's embedded in that larger reality. When we integrate Nietzsche's brilliance with life's telos, we get strong individuals who strengthen society, not heroic outcasts, not contemptuous elites, but mature contributors whose creativity serves the whole. That's the synthesis. And that, I think, is where Nietzsche's thought finally becomes whole. As I've been reflecting on all of this, Nietzsche's brilliance, his blind spots, the need for responsible stewardship, the founders' extraordinary attempt to balance individual freedom with collective cohesion, I keep coming back to something even deeper, more fundamental. A question that sits underneath everything I'm trying to say in these videos. Camus once said that the most important philosophical question is whether an individual should commit suicide. If you cannot justify the continuation of your own life, nothing else matters. But there's an equally important version of that question at the collective level. Is human life, our life together, worth preserving? Because if the answer is yes, then we must ask how. We must ask what kinds of systems, values, and forms of cooperation allow life to flourish. We must ask what kinds of cultures sustain us, and which ones ultimately destroy us. And if we don't grapple with that question, we drift towards something like a slow civilizational suicide, not through intent, but through inattention. This is what brings me to tears. Grief for what we're losing, trust, meaning, shared reality, and the kind of responsible stewardship that used to hold societies together. But also gratitude for what human beings have been capable of, for rare moments when people rose to the challenge with extraordinary clarity, like the creation of the American Constitutional Republic. They built more than a nation. They built a model for how a civilization might hold itself together. And that, ultimately, is what motivates me to make these videos. Because if human life is worth preserving, and I believe it is, the only way forward is to rediscover what life itself requires from us, not just as individuals, but as a species living in a broader ecosystem. Nietzsche wanted us to take responsibility for our own becoming. What I'm saying is we also need to take responsibility for our collective becoming. And whether we do that or not, whether we choose life or drift away from it, that will shape our future. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. I appreciate your willingness to give this your sustained attention. If you got something out of this exploration, please give it a like, subscribe, and leave me a comment. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.